Hey everybody, what's going on? CHH here, and you're watching Planet CHH. So today is certainly what you could consider a main event in this series that we're doing, Taking Shape, the book. Let me move my Freddy out the way. This book is phenomenal. If you're a big Halloween fan, I dare say you'll learn a few things about these movies that maybe you haven't heard before. Stuff that certainly isn't in documentaries or anything like that. And this is Halloween 6, one that I was so eager to get to because, quite frankly, this is the most dramatic behind the scenes, the most disruptive Halloween entry there is. I tried to pull things that I think would be the most beneficial for this episode, but I'm going to tell you now, I could have done a 50 or 100 facts about Halloween 6 that you may not have known. God knows I learned a lot, so why don't we just go ahead and get right into it. Here we go. 10 crazy facts about Halloween, the Curse of Michael Myers. Alright, so the first thing I want to talk about is the line in the beginning of the movie when you hear people on the radio talking to Barry Sims, the Howard Stern wannabe, if you will. Basically, they couldn't get Howard Stern. Everybody knows that's not included in here. So they made up a guy named Barry Sims. Well, one of the guys on the radio asks Barry Sims, hey, whatever happened to Michael Myers? Somebody said they shot him into space or something like that. Did you know that Daryl Farrens wrote that in as a joke at a pitch that, get ready for this, John Carpenter and New Line were pitching to make for the next Halloween film? Obviously, as we'll see, Akkad went with Miramax, who bid the most money, but Carpenter and New Line had a pitch that they were going for, and I'm sure I'm going to read all about that pitch in Taking Shape 2, the unmade Halloween sequels. But that line, I heard they shot him into space, is a playful joke. Daniel says he doesn't make it a dig because he thinks it's ridiculous. Maybe he thinks it's ridiculous, but he didn't want to say that. But he made it a lighthearted joke that they were going to make a Michael Myers movie where they shot him into space. You know, so it's interesting. This is just an off tangent real quick, but we always talk about how John seemingly wanted to get away from the Halloween franchise. What I think it was is he didn't want to do the same thing over and over again, which is why he made a pitch for Halloween 4 that we talked about that didn't get used, and what we're hearing about now with shooting Michael into space. Pretty interesting considering what's going on right now, though, with John Carpenter's involvement, though. Alright, so you have to excuse me. I'm going to have to look at my phone for a little bit about this because there's a lot to dig into with these. But the second fact for this video is the original pitch for a Halloween 6 after Miramax had secured the deal was written by a guy named Philip Rosenberg. He had a pitch that had Michael Myers being a homeless person, and Dr. Loomis was a patient himself at Smith Grove Sanitarium. So by this point, this pitch that this movie had things all over the map. You had Michael seemingly being this homeless guy, which we all probably wonder what he does every night besides Halloween, and it sounds like this movie kind of wanted to explore that, and Loomis himself had gone crazy, and I can totally see how and why. He's probably a crazy alcoholic by this point, so he's now a patient in this hospital himself. So kind of flipping things there a little bit. Interesting pitch. Hard to judge without seeing what the actual story would have been, though, but that is the original pitch that Miramax and Akkad looked at for the film Halloween 6. Now, going back to what I just said, when I say original pitch that they both looked at, that's what I mean collectively after Miramax had secured the deal. But did you know that Daniel Farrens had reached out to Mustafa Akkad in 1990 with his pitch for the movie that we would somewhat see? So Daniel Farrens initially pitched his movie to Mustafa Akkad in 1990, shortly after the release of Halloween 5. Akkad looked at it but refused that script. But one thing that was interesting was Daniel Farrens had made this Halloween Bible book, and Akkad kept that book in hand and used it when mulling over multiple scripts when he was considering what the next Halloween film could be. So that's very interesting to note that even though Akkad was not interested in the pitch that Daniel Farrens had initially, Daniel Farrens was a super fan and had a Halloween Bible with all the lore and things that had happened up to that point and how to connect things and what Michael would and wouldn't do, seemingly. And Akkad really appreciated that, so he held on to that book and referenced it when looking at other scripts. Wow, that was interesting. I did not know that. Okay, so once the filming of Halloween 6 was underway, it was pandemonium, and we're going to talk more about that throughout the rest of this video. But as things were happening, there were studio notes coming left and right. And one of those studio notes was this. One studio note wanted Tommy Doyle to go visit Michael's mom in a retirement home for clues on where Michael was and how to stop Michael Myers. Now, the reason we're getting all of these studio notes is because we're going to learn how bad it was behind the scenes. The Akkads and Daniel Farrens were seeing eye to eye Miramax was not seeing eye to eye with the Akkads and Daniel Farrands, and there was this other producer in the mix of things that was just kind of screwing everything up. Well, I'm really excited to talk about this guy because I never hear this guy's name referenced, but this book was referenced heavily from Daniel Farrands himself, so we're going to talk more about that soon. Here was another interesting studio note that was sent in. The ending of this movie was so undecided, with all these people having different ideas and not being happy on what to do. Here was one studio note that really pushed things to a new envelope, so to speak. One studio note wanted Michael to become a sympathetic character, stating, "Developing a sense of sympathy for Michael in Act 3. Since this is supposed to be the end of his reign of terror, he's been a pawn all this time. We could see him at the cult's mercy during the finale. They're prodding him, treating him like an animal in a cage. He fights back, leading us to the climax when both..." So by the sound of this weird pitch that was coming in from the studio, it sounded like they wanted Michael to almost 180, like he was a decent dude that was under the spell of a cult, which is kind of what you see in that producer's cut, but they don't go anywhere near that. They actually kind of like back off of it and make Michael seem like he's bigger or stronger than the cult. Like, screw you guys, I'm evil, I'm out of here, I've just been playing along this whole time. It's a lot of weirdness, and no surprise, because even with the producer's cut, based on the things that I read, there is still so much craziness that either got cut from the film, wasn't filmed, changed, rearranged, re-edited. There's chains in the background of the climax where Michael is supposed to get hung, but they never even filmed it because there was no time. It was truly insanity that I don't think any documentary has really dove into. If there could be a definitive documentary on Halloween 6 with all the craziness, well, quite frankly, it's this book, because they talked about all of it, but it was beyond insanity. But that pitch had Michael becoming like a good guy. Okay, so this is something that's kind of been discussed, but I've never heard it been discussed in this much detail. So let's talk about what happened when there was a cut of Halloween 6, the first real cut of Halloween 6. Well, Miramax said, we're going to go test screen this. As we're going to see, Miramax has always been heavy-handed with their test screenings. Most studios are, but Miramax was notorious for test screening the hell out of stuff. This was the initial test screening that they had, and this is what led to the inevitable major downfalls and the big problems between Miramax and the Akkads. The Weinsteins held a test screening to what now has been described by many from the crew as a, quote, teenage boy, quote, primary audience, whom absolutely hated the film. With less than 5 months away, the Weinsteins axed several colleagues from collaborating, including producer Paul Friedman, Malick Akkad, and his dad, Mustafa, where Malick soon filed a lawsuit against Miramax and the Weinsteins, but ultimately decided to drop it for the sake of the film's release and not getting bad press. So when this test screening comes out, I know that the producers and the studios and the Akkads all were in disagreement, but I didn't know that Malick had filed a lawsuit and that the Miramax people were like, and Bob and Harvey essentially were like, screw the Akkads, we don't want you guys in here, you guys are trying to make this crazy, ridiculous movie. Because as we're learning, Mustafa really liked the soap opera aspect of this series. Mustafa really wanted to go into what the story was. Now, I'm a fan of that, but not everybody is. But I got to appreciate Mustafa's drive to continue the lore of the character and things like that, whereas it seemed like Miramax wanted to go back to basics, but not really. I don't think they know what they really wanted, which is why obviously the next film is going to be a complete retread of the whole series. But yeah, it got so ugly that the Weinsteins kicked the Akkads out of being on set at this point after the first test screening. They were extremely angry. But as we've seen, well, Harvey's got serious issues, but Bob has clear anger issues. I read about him yelling on the phone, keep them the F off the set, they're ruining this effing movie, they don't know what the F they're doing. It was insanity. Alright, so when reshoots began, here is something that I read about with people collaborating for new parts and new scenes for the end of the movie. When the reshoots began, Daniel Farrands did pen some writing, which did get shot down. Interestingly enough, so did Joe Chappelle, and we're going to talk a lot about Joe Chappelle at the end of this video, where Joe Chappelle had a scene with Karen Strode gunning down cult members with a machine gun. I can only picture that in my head, and it seems amazing. but I can't wait to talk more about Joe Chappelle at the end of this. Alright, so the 8th fact about Halloween 6. Now, we have all heard from the fans, I'm guilty of this as well, that Joe Chappelle didn't care about this movie. He was on autopilot, he wasn't concerned about it. As I was reading this book, I was learning from Daniel Farron's mouth himself, with the interviews and things, that really wasn't the case. There was one guy that was a producer on this film that seemingly was causing a lot of grief for everybody, and that guy's name was Paul Freeman. Now, this is something that Daniel Farron said regarding Paul Freeman. Farron takes a jab at producer Paul Freeman in the film with the line, "We're taking the show back to the Myers house where we should have done this in the first place." You remember that's what Barry Sims says when he's starting to do his local show in Haddonfield, where he finds out that one of his guests lives in the Myers house, and that's what he tells his producer on the phone. Daniel Farron wrote that line as a jab at Paul Freeman because from the beginning, everybody wanted to include the original Myers house in this film. But Paul Freeman, a producer on Halloween 6, thought it was a stupid idea. He didn't want to do it at all, so obviously we got a different Myers house in the film. As we know now, that Myers house had moved slightly down the street, and it was still intact, and they could have used it for the film. This guy thought it was stupid to go back to the original Myers house, among many other things. Daniel talked about Paul Freeman coming up with horrible ideas, being a lazy second unit director. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know how to get the cameras in focus. He was a disaster. And it's not just Daniel that said this too. So this Paul Freeman guy seems to be one of the biggest culprits for just stirring the pot of messiness on the production of this movie. Not so much Joe Chappelle, but again, more on that. Alright, so here's something interesting that Daniel Farron had wrote with the character of Tommy Doyle, played by Paul Rudd, which again, I'm going to give you a little bit of information on Paul Rudd at the end of this too. I got a lot of extras in this episode. In Daniel Farron's original plans with the script for Halloween 6, his character of Tommy Doyle was a much more well-rounded individual. In the original plan, Tommy Doyle's character had him working at a college radio station, he had a girlfriend, and Lindsay Wallace was his co-host of the radio show. And the story was going to involve Lindsay and Tommy Doyle wanting to do like this on-radio piece on Michael Myers, where Paul Rudd's character was big into trying to figure out what was going on with Michael and the lore and understanding more, where Lindsay Wallace wanted to move on. She didn't want to deal with it, which kind of talks about the effect of, you know, subduing Halloween in the town of Haddonfield. There are still some things that were intact from his original drafts of this, but that whole thing was stricken. Kind of sad we didn't get that, quite honestly. So this is going to be 11 facts with a little bit of tidbits at the end. So the 10th fact of Halloween 6 that I'd like to talk about was in the original concept for Halloween 6, the character of John Strode, when he returns home after that day where Loomis visits the wife and they are all dead now. Well, John returns to his house. It was supposed to be dark in there, but the TV was supposed to be on, and no other movie than Halloween 3 was supposed to be playing on the TV, where John Strode says, "What is this crap?" Because Halloween 3 was Universal, they would have gotten the rights to do that, so that was just axed. But that would have been cool. I would have been happy to see Halloween 3 play in Halloween 6, especially since I'm a big fan of Halloween 6. So the 11th fact, and I just had to bring this up, because I said I was trying to... There was a lot of things I could have put in here, but this is something I really want to put in this video, because I think it's important to talk about Malick a little bit. As you know, Malick is now the spearheader of the Halloween franchise. He decides which way we're going. He is carrying the torch, so to speak, from his pops. Malick was a first-time producer on this film, and him and Daniel Farron were really close, according to Daniel. They were two 20-something-year-olds full of passion for this movie, and they wanted it to be really good. Malick really was passionate about this movie, and they were both seeing how just distraught the movie business could be with these quote-unquote old-time producers cutting corners, not wanting to do things the proper way, cutting scenes despite the fact how crucial they could be. Well, this was a story that Daniel told about Malick that I thought was just really cool. So in the scene where Mrs. Blankenship is talking to the kid about the history of Halloween, and then you'll see Paul Rudd walking through the town where they're having the festival, and those bonfires are going off in the background. Well, Daniel talked about how the producers did not want to light the bonfires on fire. They piled up all the wood and they were going to set the bonfires off. The producers did not want to pay the permits to do that because they needed to, quote-unquote, save money for the film. Well, they knew how important that was to the essence of the scene. The fires, the bonfires were so important. Malick got so pissed off about how cheap the producers wanted to be on set that Malick set the bonfires off himself because the old producers didn't want to pay the permits. It was crucial to the scene where Mrs. Blankenship was telling stories about the old days of Halloween. And Daniel Farron said that Malick looked at him when they were about to just start rolling without the bonfires being lit, and he said, "Screw this, I don't care about the permits, these old producers can kiss my ass, I am lighting these bonfires off so we can make the scene look better." So, Malick, I applaud you, dude. I don't think your praises get sung enough. Obviously, Mustafa is such a mainstay in this franchise. You can't think about Halloween without thinking about Mustafa, but hearing a story like that about you, dude, cheers. That is awesome. So 2 bonus things I want to talk about. In this book, Daniel Farron's talked about running into Paul Rudd just a few years ago at an airport, presumably LAX or something. He said that when he ran into Paul Rudd, Paul was with his wife and he saw Daniel Farron's. He said when Paul saw Daniel, he rushed him with a look of happiness and glee, and he says, "This is the guy who wrote the script for my first movie." And he said it passionately. I know us fans wonder all the time, what does Paul Rudd think about Halloween 6? Well, based on this encounter, it sounds like Paul, even though he doesn't go out of his way to want to talk about the film, has no problems being proud of his roots. So I think that's really cool. And he talked about how lovely Paul is and how dedicated he was doing the movie and how passionate Paul was during the making of the film. Paul wanted to make a good movie too, and he did the best to his ability what he could with the film, but it seems like it was such an S-storm the entire time. Nobody really knew what or how to do it, but he does make it sound like Paul is proud of being in a Halloween movie, so that's awesome. And the last thing I want to say is about the director Joe Chappelle. Daniel was asked extensively about Joe Chappelle in this book, and he says that the real criminal of Halloween 6 was the producer Paul Freeman, not Joe Chappelle. He talked extensively about how this guy Paul was coming up with terrible ideas left and right, spearheading second unit stuff where he was treating scenes like an 8-year-old who just got his first Super 8 camera, and that's a quote from Daniel in this book. And he talked about how Joe would come up to Daniel all the time and say, "Look, dude, I really want to make your film. I have no reason to want to change anything up. These Miramax people are telling me I have to do this. I can't shoot this. And I'm in a position where I'm trying to start my career and do the right thing." Daniel does criticize Joe for not picking his battles enough, and even though he doesn't hold it against him, he does wish that Joe would have spoken up more, but he does not blame Joe Chappelle at all for the mishaps with Halloween 6. In essence, he says, look, the real criminal was Paul Freeman and kind of Miramax, but Joe Chappelle was a director. He had to do what his bosses told him to, but to say he wasn't passionate is complete BS. He was treated horribly by fans after this and got the brunt of the, criticism for the film, when in fact it really needs to go to Paul Freeman, this producer, and kind of Miramax. So I thought it was good that Daniel set the record straight, because I'm guilty too. I have said, well, this Joe Chappelle guy, he just wanted this 3-picture deal with Miramax. We've heard it been talked about, and he didn't care. When Daniel says that's just not true, he was trying to make the best movie possible and worked in alignment with Daniel as much as he could, but Miramax were too dominant in the production of the film. So there it is, guys. I hope you learned something cool about Halloween 6 that maybe you haven't already. This was the most compelling chapter to read about, and I hope that H2O and Resurrection and the Rob Zombie films give even more enlightenment on these entries. But if you enjoyed this, as always, please give it a thumbs up and let me know what you might have learned about. My name is CHH, Christian Hannah Horror. This is Planet CHH. I appreciate you watching this video. Please stick around because we've got a lot more coming up. And of course, we'll be doing H2O next. See you guys next time. Thank you to all my supporters on Patreon. To get behind the scenes photos, videos, and music, you can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month.